nervous, these verses are pretty tame. We're going to read it several times tonight, this morning. You're in Song of Songs, chapter 8. You're usually just a page before Isaiah, right before Isaiah. And this is how this duet ends between Solomon and this woman he loves. Sort of like a play. There's like a little bit of a story being told. And this is one of the profound statements that Solomon, in all of his wisdom given by the Holy Spirit, says about love. Verse 6, set me as a seal upon your heart, as a seal upon your arm. For love is as strong as death, jealousy as cruel as the grave. Its flames are flames of fire, a most vehement flame. Many waters cannot quench love, nor can the floods drown it. If a man would give for love all the wealth of his house, it would be utterly despised. Try to just break that passage down into pieces. He says, hey, set me as a seal upon your heart. Like, this is me. I need you to put me in a permanent place in your heart because I love you and you love me, right? He says this is what love is. Love is as strong as death. And to be honest, I don't know what else would be as strong as death. There's only one man I know of that's even ever conquered death, and that was the Christ. And Solomon makes a very bold statement here that this love is as strong as death. There's really no beating it unless you're prepared to beat it, or maybe you have a divine force helping you defeat it. Then he explains that jealousy is cruel as the grave. And I don't think we should be shocked here that jealousy is brought up here in a definition of love. Jealousy isn't necessarily always evil. Jealousy is just a consequence of love. If you really do love someone, you're going to be jealous for them. You're going to be jealous for their attention. If you have a spouse, you should love your spouse. And as a consequence of that, you will be jealous for their attention. God himself loves humanity. And what is he towards humanity about attention? He is jealous for humanity's attention, and he tells that to us throughout the whole Bible. He doesn't even try to hide that. Now, verse 7, many waters cannot quench love. And the concept of this is love, it's like a fire. Can you douse it with water? No, not even many waters. You can turn the whole river on it. Won't turn out love. You can't drown it with a flood. It's just impossible. And then he says this, if a man would give for love all the wealth of his house, he would be utterly despised. And I think the thought is that if you take a man and you say, I can give you what you love, or you can pursue this love, but it's going to cost you everything you have, then what would you find in his house? Well, his house would be empty because he would have given everything for the thing that he loved, right? So is love a powerful force? Well, Solomon says it's the most powerful force we have access to, right there along with death. And so what I want to do is look at 3 Bible passages that talk about 2 people loving each other. And I want to go back to this one passage here and use this sort of as a guide to explain this very powerful force. If y'all can think about couples that loved each other, and even romantic couples like this one here in Song of Songs that loved each other in the Bible, who would you think of? Or maybe just a one-way relationship where one person loved the other person. Do any of y'all think of these people? Samson and Delilah? Because Judges begins with the line that Samson did love Delilah. I don't think there's any question whether Samson loved Delilah or not. Now, we could have a different conversation about whether Delilah loved him back, but Samson did love Delilah. Would this passage apply to their relationship? I think it actually would, at least one way. Let's turn to Judges chapter 16. Flip backwards with me to the book of Judges. In chapter 16, Samson has already really accomplished many of his major feats. But here's the last story we have of Samson, where he has a run-in with this woman named Delilah, and he loves her. Look here, starting in verse 4. Delilah has plotted with the Philistines to capture Samson. He says, afterward, it happened that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, entice him and find out where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to afflict him, and every one of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver. And just a pause right there. Samson has been a problem for the Philistines for a long time. the Holy Spirit takes over him and he becomes incredibly strong, and he does these terrorizing things to the Philistines. He set all their fields on fire, right? He killed 1,000 of their soldiers. They don't know what to do with him. So finally, they come to the decision, okay, we found this person that Samson really loves. Let's get her to figure out what his weakness is so we can put a stop to the terrorizing that Samson has brought upon our nation. And so now verse 6. So Delilah said to Samson, please tell me where your great strength lies, and with what you may be bound to afflict you. And Samson said to her, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. So the lords of the Philistines brought her to her 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, and she bound him with them. Now men were lying in wait, staying with her in the room. And she said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he broke the bowstrings as a strand of yarn breaks when he touches fire, so the secret of his strength was not known. Then Delilah said to Samson, look, you have mocked me and told me lies. Now please tell me what we may bound you with, what you may be bound with. So she said to her, if they bind me securely with new ropes that have never been used, then I shall become weak like any other man. Then Delilah took new ropes and bound them with him and said to him, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And men were lying in wait, staying in the room, but he broke them off his arms like a thread. Delilah said to Samson, until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me what you may be bound with. And he said to her, if you weave the 7 locks of my head into the web of the loom. So she wove it tightly with the batten of the loom and said to them, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. But he awoke from his sleep and pulled out the batten and the web from the loom. And she said to him, how can you say to me, I love you, when your heart is not with me? You have mocked me these 3 times and have not told me where your great strength lies. And it came to pass when she had pestered him daily with her words and pressed him so that his soul was vexed to death, that he told her all his heart and said to her, no razor has ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazarite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. When Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called for the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up once more, for he has told me all in his heart. So the lords of the Philistines came to her, and she brought the money in their hand. Then she lulled him to sleep on her knees and called for a man to have him shave off the 7 locks of his head. Then he began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. So he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as before as the other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had departed with him. Then the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza, and they bound him with brown feathers, and he became a grinder in the prison. Did Samson love Delilah? The story begins with that he loved Delilah. And then finally, she gets the real answer from him in verse 15 when she challenges him and she says, you say you love me. And eventually it says that his soul was vexed to death. We're going to get death brought up again. And so Samson, the 4th time, finally reveals where his strength comes from. Now, before we kind of analyze this with our passage, let me say this. It's very obvious that Samson is not the brightest crayon in the box. And I'm not trying to argue that he is, and love overcame him even though he's not the brightest crayon in the box. However, love will make you do some very foolish things, and especially here. He should have never revealed, and he should have never stayed with a woman that had Philistines staying in the room every time he woke up. You know, there's some things there that should be painfully obvious. With us, with a bird's eye view, it's very apparent that those things are very obvious. So we can hold that there and remember at least that much. But I do still believe that evidently Samson here was faced with love, and love ended up being stronger than death, or strong as death, and brought his undoing. What we learn here in verse 12 is love will make you choose purpose over self-preservation. It would have been in Samson's best interest not to tell Delilah what was going on or how he received his strength. I mean, that would have made sense, right? Because every time he tells her, well, if you do dried bowstrings or you do new rope or whatever it may be, you tie up my hair in 7 locks. What does he wake up every morning with? With the very thing that he had just told her. So it should be very obvious that self-preservation was not in Samson's interest here. What was his interest with this story? It was his purpose to convince Delilah that he really loved her. So here's a man that chooses purpose over his own logical self-preservation. And where does it end up? It ends up with him with his eyes cut out, being a grinder in a Philistine prison. And here's number 2. Love will ultimately drive you to act. He could have just kept on feeding this woman lies. But when you get to verse 15 and you get this line, how can you say to me, I love you? All of a sudden, it's like finally Samson's love for Delilah overpowers him, and he finally just tells her the truth when he should have known that he would have woken up with his hair gone. I mean, he should have known. That's just what's happened over and over again. But certainly here, love drives him to act and finally tell Delilah the truth of the matter because he loves her. And number 3 as well. Ultimately, who you love chooses what you sacrifice. So you don't get to choose what you sacrifice. Here, the love you have for someone, that person gets to choose who you sacrifice. And so what does love really do here? Love relinquishes the choice in the matter of what you have to give up, right? And let me make this very bold, and we're going to say this every time this morning. If this is all the case, and Delilah chooses that Samson is going to now be handed over to the Philistines in this weakened state, she's been given or handed the choice for Samson to figure out what his destiny is going to be. And I know we all know the end of the story, and we know that the Lord was able to use this for something bigger, but we're not going to go that far this morning. But Samson does relinquish his choice of what he's going to sacrifice over to this person that he loves. So what should be the logical conclusion? I think the logical conclusion is be careful who you choose to love, because they might hand you over to the Philistines. I feel like that's really one of the purposes of the story. Be very careful how you choose to love. Now, I think some of us, and maybe not all of us, but we're confused by that phrase, be careful who you choose to love. Because you go, well, hold on just a second. I didn't necessarily choose to love this person. I just love this person. Where was the choice? And I'm trying to say this in the nicest way, and I'm not trying any kind of cruelty to this. I just want to snap us out of it. I felt that way about love when I was 15 years old. That was my understanding of how love works. That you don't choose it, it just happens. And no credit to our 15-year-olds, which are very mature people. I'm not trying to put y'all down. I think y'all already got this. When we're teenagers, we think love is like a light switch that you accidentally bump into. Oh, the lights are on. I love this person. And we'll tell people, I think I'm in love with them. You've only known them a couple hours. What you really should be saying, you probably should be saying, I lust for them, which obviously is playing a role in this story as well. But we treat it like it's a light switch, and then all of a sudden we may accidentally bump the light switch off. Oh, it's dark now. I don't love them anymore. That was nice while that lasted, but I just don't love them no more. Well, you act like you fell in and you fell into love like it was an accident. And I really feel, from a more mature understanding of this, love is not like a light switch where you fall in, you fall out of. Love is a choice because ultimately you end up loving who you pursue. That's who you end up loving. And instead, I've heard this analogy, which I think is better. Love isn't like a light switch. Love is like a freight train. It's very powerful. And once it's going, it's very difficult to stop. And you can slam on the emergency brakes and stop the freight train, but somebody or you are going to get hurt in the process of it. But ultimately, you did decide to start up the freight train. And you did make the choice to give it the energy it needs to really get rolling. Now, you might have to derail it like evidently Samson should have with Delilah. But once it's going, it's very difficult to stop it. So should you be careful who you choose to love? Yes, and what am I really saying? You should be very careful who you choose to pursue. Because if you keep on waking up and there's Philistines in the room, maybe we need to derail the freight train, lest we end up with our eyes gouged out in a prison, right? Y'all kind of see where I'm going to this. Well, why does Samson ultimately, and I know not the brightest crayon in the box, why does he ultimately tell Delilah his secret and end up in the state he's in at the end of verse 20? Because Love is as strong as death. Jealousy is cruel as the grave. Its flames are flames of fire, a most vehement flame. Many waters cannot quench love, nor can the floods drown it. If a man would give for love all the wealth of his house, or his eyes, or his strength, it would be utterly despised. Is love strong as death? Love is strong as death. Now, let me do two other people that loved actually each other, and not in a romantic sense, but certainly the word love is also used. Peter loved Jesus, didn't he? And Peter told Jesus he loved him 3 times. Jesus kept on kind of pestering him about it, where even Peter's soul was vexed a little bit. Let's turn to the end of the book of John. John chapter 21. I think y'all would have covered this in the large auditorium last week. This is the very last story that John gives us. What has happened is Jesus has raised from the dead, and he has appeared to several of the disciples as they're fishing on the Sea of Galilee. John says, look, it's Jesus. Peter puts on his clothes and jumps in the water to swim out to him. Jesus makes them all breakfast on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And as they're eating breakfast, and now that they've concluded, Jesus and Peter have this conversation. In verse 15, so when they had eaten breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me more than these? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, feed my lambs. So he said to him again a second time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? He said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. He said to him, tend my sheep. He said to him a third time, Simon, son of Jonah, do you love me? Peter was grieved because he had said to him the third time, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. Most assuredly, I say to you, when you were younger, you girded yourself and walked where you wished. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. This he spoke, signifying by what death he would glorify God. And when he had spoken this, he said to him, follow me, which is one of the very first things Jesus had told Peter, right? It's kind of a complete circle there for the story. Jesus has done making them breakfast. And by the way, are any of us too good to wake up in the morning and make everybody else breakfast? No. If Jesus is willing to make the disciples breakfast, I think we all can get down in there and make breakfast for everyone, right? We're done eating breakfast. And Jesus asked Peter, do you love me? And he's like, yeah, of course I love you, right? And so he says, okay, well, feed my lambs. And then a second time, and maybe some time has even passed, but it's obviously we're still here right after we're still sitting in the same place. He says, oh, Peter, do you love me? And notice he's not even saying Peter, he's saying Simon Bar-Jonah, which there might be a little message in there as well. He's saying, do you love me? And Peter's like, Lord, you know that I love you. He says, okay, well, tend my sheep. And then finally a third time, very similar to Delilah's third time. Do you love me? And Peter, really vexed in his soul, says, Lord, you know all things. Of course I love you. Why do you keep on asking me? And he says, okay, feed my sheep. And then what does Jesus give next? Jesus prophesies Peter to the way that he's going to die. He says, most assuredly, I say to you that when you're younger, you gird yourself and walk where you wish. But when you're old, you will stretch out your hands, another will gird you and carry you where you do not wish. He spoke, signifying the death that he would glorify God. And if you're me, I never met anyone that disagreed with this, but I respect that it's not outright said. But it very much seems to me that he's describing crucifixion, especially with your hands being stretched out. And so basically, he asked Peter 3 times, do you love me? He gives him a job, feed my sheep. And he goes, oh, by the way, this is what you're going to give for that. And that's the end of the story. Follow me. So what can we make up about or make out here about Peter loving Jesus? Well, I think number 1, love will make you choose purpose over self-preservation. Peter had a wife. And maybe now, maybe later, I don't know, but ultimately Peter had children because we know that he served as an elder. Peter also had a job. And he's in, a job with his brother and 2 of his friends, James and John. They have a home, they have a house. And then all of a sudden one day, with all these goals, I'm sure Peter has a lot of the similar goals that we do. We want to get in here and work and live as comfortably as possible and get out, which is a fine life. I mean, that's what he's gunning for. But all of a sudden, His brother runs up and says, hey, we found the Messiah. The Messiah shows up, spends some time with him, and says, hey, follow me. And now what does Peter have for the rest of his life instead of going back to Galilee and being a fisherman? Now he has purpose. And Peter ends up choosing purpose over the own little comfy life he could have cut out for himself. And obviously, he only does that because he loves Jesus and going along right with that. What else do we learn about love here? Love will drive you to act. Let's keep our finger here, but let's turn to 2 Peter 1:12. This is obviously during the beginning of Peter's life as an apostle. And here we're looking at the very end of Peter's life as an apostle. And there's obviously some reflection on what he's been doing this whole time. And this is what he says here in verse 12 of 2 Peter chapter 1. He says, for this reason, I will not be negligent to remind you always of these things, though you know and are established in the present truth. Yes, I think that is right, as long as I'm in this tent, to stir you up by reminding you, knowing that I shortly must put off this tent, just as our Lord Jesus Christ showed me. Moreover, I will be careful to ensure that you always have a reminder of these things after my decease. Peter here is about to die. The second century writers tell us he's about to be executed. And what is he telling the Christians in this letter? He's saying, guys, I'm not going to forget. I need to remind you of these things. And not only do I need to continue to remind you of these things, I also am going to leave a written record so I can continue to remind you of these things even after I'm dead. Because I'm about to have to put off this tent like the Lord has showed me. I'm about to have to die like the Lord had told me about, right? So what is Peter still doing after all these years? Is he not still feeding the sheep? Is he not still tending to the lambs? Peter, with all the other things he could have been doing, what has he spent these last years doing instead? He's acted on the thought that he did love the Christ. And now he's not doing what he wants to do. He's acting on what the Lord would want him to do because he loves the Lord. And this, of course, goes in right directly to it. Who you love chooses what you sacrifice. If y'all have noticed, these points were copy and pasted to this as well. Delilah was loved by Samson. So what did Delilah get to choose? Delilah got to choose to sell Samson out to the Philistines. And he has his eyes cut out and he becomes a grinder in the prison. He relinquished his sacrifices over to Delilah. He basically was like, hey, you choose. You get to pick what happens to me because I'm going to follow you blindly anywhere. Well, now what is Peter also done with the Christ? He's allowed the Lord to choose what's going to happen to him. And evidently, what does the Lord allow for it to happen to Peter when his time is up? The Lord allowed Peter to be crucified just like the Lord was. It's very kind of a scary thought, and here a very noble thought. That he's going to have to die in the same manner that the way the person he loved the most was going to die or had already died. So what you love chooses what you ultimately sacrifice. So what should you do? Well, you should be very careful who you love. Because if you love the Lord, there's also going to be sacrifices. And the Lord is going to get to decide what those sacrifices are going to be most of the time. It's the proposition. This is what it's about. But will you gladly walk to those sacrifices if you really love the Lord? I'm not sure exactly of the historical credibility of what Peter says on the cross. I'm a little bit more confident about the historical credibility about what Andrew said when he went to the cross. But the legend is that when Andrew the apostle went to the cross, he told the people crucifying him, I've been waiting for this happy moment my entire life. And whether that was said or not, it can't be 100% certain. Does that not attribute to the way that these apostles felt about the sacrifice they were going to offer the Lord? Even to the cross, did Peter still love Jesus? He still loved Jesus, and he was happy to even give this ultimate sacrifice for the one he loved. Why is that the case? Well, I go back to the Song of Songs. For love is strong as death. Jealousy is cruel as the grave. Its flames are flames of fire, a most vehement flame. Many waters cannot quench love, nor can the floods drown it. If a man would give for love, this time I could say his entire life, it would be utterly despised, because love is as strong as death. And let's do it one more time. What about Joshua loving the Lord? Let's go all the way back to where we started. Before Judges, if you turn to the book of Joshua, Joshua in his last sermons leaves us with a comment about loving the Lord. Turn to chapter 22. This is Joshua talking to the Reubenites and the Gadites in the East Manasseh tribe that are returning back on the other side of the Jordan because they fulfilled their vow to Moses to come and help conquer the land. And this is what Joshua leaves them with here in verse 1. Then Joshua called the Reubenites, the Gadites, and half the tribe of Manasseh and said to them, "You have kept all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, and have obeyed my voice in all that I commanded you. You have not left your brethren these many days up to this day, but you have kept the charge of the commandment of the Lord your God. And now the Lord of God has given them rest to your brethren, as he promised them. Now therefore return and go to the tents and to the land of the possession, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of the Jordan. But take careful heed to do the commandment and the law which Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his commandments, to hold fast to him, and to serve him with all your heart and in all your soul." So Joshua blessed them and sent them away, and they went to their tents. What does Joshua leave these three tribes with? Be careful. Be careful to take heed to love the Lord your God. And then he even describes some things that go around that and that are in fellowship with those things. But also flip over to chapter 23, verse 11. He says the same thing in his next sermon. Verse 11 of the next chapter, take careful heed to yourselves that you love the Lord your God, or else the Lord's going to abandon you if you go to these other nations. So take careful heed to love the Lord your God. And we said it at the very beginning. But is love something that happens by accident? And really here with the way that Joshua phrases this, does Joshua believe that love is something that happens by accident? No, he says take careful heed. Be sure of that you love the Lord your God, or else these terrible things will fall upon you. Back to chapter 22, these are the things he combines with it. Take careful heed to love the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to keep his commandments, to hold fast to him and to serve him with all your heart and your soul. That's what loving the Lord your God looks like. So to go back to these different love situations, why did Samson love Delilah? And I'm sure there's a lot of things we could read into it, and we do read into that story a lot. But just on a baseline, why did Samson love Delilah? Was it not because he had spent time with her? I mean, that would obviously be the baseline, right? He had spent time with Delilah, and that's why he loved her. And even another baseline, why did Peter love Jesus? Was it not because he had just spent 3.5 of his years of his life following him? I mean, that's why he loved Jesus. He's sitting there eating breakfast with Jesus. Of course he loves Jesus. He gave him the time and day to love him. And even Joshua here, how does Joshua love the Lord? Because he's given him the time and day to love him. And the thought is here is that if you will give God a chance, you will love him. You really will. He's very lovable. He's very helpful. And once you give enough energy to get that freight train moving, it'll start moving, and hey, you're going to love the Lord. And I think of y'all that are a lot older than me, I think you'll attest to this. Do you love the Lord more now than you did when you first obeyed the gospel? You probably do. Why? That freight train's been running a long time now, and you put a lot of fire in the furnace. What's the fire you're putting in the furnace to keep that freight train going? Well, one, you walk in his ways. 2, you keep his commandments. And Jesus really sort of robbed this from, I guess, himself. But he robbed this statement, if you love me, keep my commandments. And that's right here in Joshua. To hold fast to him. If you hold on to him, you will love him. If you serve him with all your heart and your soul, it'd be very easy to love him. And that's how you ultimately love the Lord. Now, and we'll say it again because we keep on saying it. So take careful heed who you choose to love. Because if you get this train a rolling, you're going to start making sacrifices that you thought you never would. When brethren go on vacation, and I'm sure that they sacrifice for that. I mean, we save up a lot of times for maybe even years so we can go on a little trip with our family. And you plan that whole trip around making sure that you can go to the assembly somewhere. Why do you make a decision like that? Well, it seems to me that when you make a decision like that, you choose purpose over self-preservation. And you might be sacrificing more of the time of the little bit of the holiday you got just to give it back a little bit to the Lord. Why do you do that? Well, it's because you love God. That's why you do that, right? When y'all are at work, or maybe even more appropriate, when some of y'all are still in school, and you see someone just being teased and berated or maybe even gossiped about, and they're just tearing into this person, why do we have the temptation to join in that cruel teasing? Is it not really because of self-preservation? Or are we not really thinking, well, I don't want to be the next one teased or bullied about this. Let me join in so I'm not the target. Well, someone who loves the Lord, what do? They choose purpose over self-preservation. And like Samson even, they're not worried about themselves. They're worried about the person that they love, being pleased with them. What about the clothes in your closet? Why do we dress the way we do? And even, on a level about lust and modesty, and those are good conversations to have, and we should have those conversations. But I think a lot of us, the reason why we dress as poorly as we do, it is not necessarily because it's just comfortable or whatever. It's usually because of self-preservation. We just want to fit in. And we do want to look like everybody else. And we want to blend in to hide. And we don't want anyone to ask us why we're not wearing that or whatever it may be. But if you love the Lord, what are you going to end up doing? You're going to choose purpose over self-preservation because you're more worried about the person you love than worrying about preserving yourself, right? And when we make all these little choices about where we work, what we do for a living, where we're going to live, if we really love the Lord, who's going to be making the choices about what we're going to sacrifice? It's going to be the Lord. He's going to make the decisions about what we sacrifice. And this is what's amazing about it. And again, I think y'all that are older than me would attest to this. You would prove with your own life that this is what has happened. The older you get and the longer you walk with him, the more you allow him in your closet and on your vacation and at your job and at school or whatever it may be. And then eventually you actually start liking the sacrifices he tells you to make. And then the next thing you know, it's just habit and you're not even thinking about it. This is just the way it is. This is what I wear. This is what I talk. This is how I don't talk about other people behind their back. This is just the way it is because this is what the Lord demands of me. And you know what's even stranger? You start liking it because you love him and he loves you. And you enjoy that love that you have with the Lord more than really anything else. And so nothing really else matters. And next thing you know, you're like Peter and you're about to be put to death. But what are you concerned about? Well, you're concerned more about your purpose, that I need to be sure to teach these people before I die. Not a lot of conversations about the death. I'm more worried about, making sure I do the job that the Lord asked me to do before I go. How does that happen? How do you have that type of transformation? And I know for us that have been Christians a long time, it might just be second nature and we aren't even thinking about it. But how in the world do you take some bum-dumb fisherman and you turn him into Peter the Apostle? For love is strong as death. Jealousy is cruel as the grave. Its flames are like flames of fire, a most vehement flame. Many waters cannot quench love, nor can the floods drown it out. If a man would give for love all the wealth of his house, it would be utterly despised. If you're really going to love the Lord, what is it going to cost? It's going to cost everything. There's nothing that's not in his grasp to be sacrificed now. However, love is such a powerful force that it's going to make all of this very possible. And next thing you know, you've transformed for so long and you're so far down the road, you don't even know how you got here. Well, you know how you got here. It's because you ultimately love the Lord. So one more time as we wrap this up, take careful heed who you choose to love, because it is going to dictate the sacrifices of your life. Thank you for your close attention. I hope that'd be helpful to you in some way. If there's anyone here that's already made the decision that they need to obey the gospel, well, evidently you love the Lord at least that much that you're willing to make the sacrifice to admit that you're broken and to admit that you need help. That is a sacrifice. And certainly if you really do love the Lord, you'll come to him to find those solutions. If anyone here needs the prayers of the congregation, we also want to make that and assist you. If you'll come forward as we stand and sing.